Ambassador Andres Rozental, thank you very much for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you with us here in Marrakesh. It's about to be the opening of the 12th edition of the Atlantic Dialogues. You are accustomed to the conference, it's not your first time coming.
My seventh time.
Oh, really? We are very happy to have you here as a former Deputy Foreign Secretary of the Mexican United States and as the founding president of COMEXI, the Mexican Council of International Affairs, which is the most prominent voice and think tank in Mexico on international relations. We are very happy that you accepted our interview to talk about a sensitive topic that the city of Marrakesh recently experienced firsthand, but that Mexico also has very extensive experience dealing with, which is that of earthquakes. Mexico notably experienced a massive earthquake in 1985, but as we were just talking, earthquakes are actually a common feature in the lives of many Mexicans. My first question would be the following. Marrakesh was close to the epicenter of the last earthquake in September, that happened in early September. What are your impressions on how the city seems to be faring, at least 3 months after?
Well, I think you're right. Mexico is situated mostly on the San Andreas Fault, which runs all the way up to California in the United States. So we have a fairly broad experience of earth tremors and earthquakes. You mentioned 1985. That was a very major earthquake with a lot of damage and a lot of casualties among the population of the city. But we also have all the time tremors and movements of these tectonic plates underneath Mexico. And we have a very strict construction code in the urban areas where buildings, high-rises that are 20, 30, 40 floors high have to have a series of special foundations which allow the buildings to move when there are earthquakes. When you had your unfortunate earthquake here in Morocco, and specifically in the Marrakesh area, it was very much like what we see in Mexico, where in the middle of the urban part of the country, of the area, there were probably fewer damages than out in the rural areas. And that's also the case in Mexico. Many of our constructions in the rural areas are not high, but they are made of materials which generally, when the earth moves, the walls or the roofs crumble. And so they create a lot of damage. I think that whenever there is an earthquake anywhere, whether in Morocco or in Afghanistan or in China, Mexicans always feel very sympathetic because we have that same experience. I was telling you that just 3 days ago, we had 4 consecutive earth tremors. We call them tremors because they really don't have a lot of damage associated to them. But in the city, the buildings move, and we have evacuation protocols to get people out. And we are the only large urban city that has a seismic alarm. Most of the earth movements in Mexico occur along the coast of the Pacific Ocean. And there's usually about 1 or 2 minute delay from the time the earthquake strikes to the time it reaches Mexico City, which is in the middle of the country. And so we have an alarm system in Mexico City where it allows people those 2 or 3 minutes to get out of the buildings to make sure that they don't suffer, no?
The Mexican experience is also very interesting because it shares a lot of common features with a country like Morocco, notably when someone looks at the poverty rates or the informal sector, and informal housing also is a component of that. And of course, crises are also an opportunity for countries to learn, for nations to know how to adapt, to build resilience. I would be very curious to know more about the way Mexico has gone from one earthquake or one tremor to the other and learned along the way. I suppose the country was largely caught by surprise after the 1985 earthquake. So how does this resilience get built over time?
It depends a lot on the type of earthquake. As you know, generally earthquakes, at least those in Mexico, sorry, the earthquakes in Mexico tend to be either what we call trepidatory or they are horizontal movements. The most damaging ones are the trepidatory earthquakes because they affect the foundations of buildings, while as the horizontal movement generally is less, has less damage associated with it. But the learning process has been over many, many decades in Mexico, especially in Mexico City and in the large urban areas of Monterrey and Guadalajara. One in which 2 or 3 things generally are learned. One is the codes for buildings, building construction. So all buildings in Mexico City have foundations that are movable so that when there are earthquakes, the buildings sway, but the buildings don't fall. That's the first learning process. And of course, that means changing building codes in the cities all the time. The second one has to do with how people react when there is an earthquake. So as I was mentioning to you, we have in Mexico City, I think, the world's only seismic alarm system, where it generally gives people a few minutes from the time an earthquake strikes along the Pacific coast of Mexico to evacuate a building and to go to a safe area. So we have 2 or 3 times a year protocols, drills of evacuation of buildings so that people know what to do, they know where to go, they know not to use the elevators, they have to go on the stairs. And this is mainly city protocols. In the countryside, it's different. First of all, because the buildings in the countryside are, in many instances, built of materials which are much less strong to be able to withstand an earthquake. And so when an earthquake hits, as it did here in the Marrakesh area and in the Atlas Mountains, you have much more damage to buildings, to constructions, partly because of poverty, but also because these protocols that we have put into place for high buildings are not adequate for single-family dwellings and so on. So you see more damage. And that's true everywhere. That happened in Turkey, it happened here, it happens in Mexico City, it's happened in China. Countries where there are frequent earthquakes, the damage in the rural areas is always more complicated. And the third part that you have to learn is the recovery effort after an earthquake, and how to get to remote areas quickly. Usually an earthquake will perhaps make the roads impassable. There are landslides that take place, and so there has to be a protocol where you can get heavy machinery and supplies and people to help in the more remote areas, especially in the mountains in Mexico. We are, Mexico City is surrounded by mountains, very high mountains. We have some volcanoes, and to be able to get to these areas, you have to have protocols of helicopters and the ability to get people to participate in the rescue efforts after an earthquake.
As you were mentioning rural areas and the ability to mobilize these human resources and supplies, I am very interested as well in the institutional setting in Mexico. We had an interview with an expert on Turkey who mentioned that there was actually a specialized agency able to deal with such events in Turkey, because Turkey is also very much accustomed to these sorts of events. But that some lessons were learned in terms of its staffing, in terms of its funding as well, and in terms of the protocols that you were rightly mentioning. Now, Mexico has another peculiarity, I believe, which is its, or particularity at least, characteristic, which is its federal system. States also have powers, as all federations. Formally at least, the federal state only has the powers that are delegated to him by the federated states, but states are important. So how does coordination happen between municipalities, states, the federal government, and maybe specialized agencies, if such thing?
Well, we have a national civil defense system, which is run by the federal government. But then each state, we have 32 states in Mexico, and each state has its own, and larger municipalities also have their protocols and their civil defense areas of structural organization. And usually what happens is that after a major incident, you have a fair degree of coordination among those three instances, but also including the Red Cross and other non-governmental institutions that come to help when it's necessary. So the coordination works quite well in general. I think the more rural, isolated areas, it's more difficult always because they are smaller and they don't have the same institutional capacity. But the federal government and the state government spend a lot of money having all of these protocols established and using them during normal times. So as I was mentioning, for example, in Mexico, we have evacuation drills 3 or 4 times a year that allow people to learn what they have to do in case of an earthquake. We learned that starting from the very first, very major earthquake we had in the 1960s, which was the one that actually caused the most damage in Mexico City. And then 1985, and we've had 3 years ago, in 2019, now 4 years ago, also a fairly major earthquake in the Mexico City region, but with very minor damage in terms of property and in terms of human costs.
So we touched upon the distribution of responsibilities, the protocols and drills, so the training of the population and the awareness about the eventuality of earthquakes happening. I am very curious about urban planning as well. We also discussed the fact that Mexico is such a huge city, a megapolis really. It used to be the largest in the world for a very long period of time, or people saw it as such. So it really embodies and encapsulates all the challenges and particularities of a big capital of the global south, right? What role can urban planning play as well, beside construction norms and standards?
Well, I think urban planning is fundamental for this. You know, many of our cities and even not the big cities, but the metropolitan areas were originally built in the times of the Spanish colony. So we're talking about the 18th, 19th century. And of course, at that time, there was very little urban planning. So today, we have very different ways of dealing with construction codes, as well as with the fundamental issues of communication, the ability to quickly advise people what to do in the case of an earthquake and so on, which we didn't have historically. And our cities, unlike, and I think it's the same in Morocco, and it's probably the same in most of the South, that our cities are less planned than the more modern, Washington, D.C. or other cities in the world, which were built much later. So Mexico City, for example, has a historic center, which is very unplanned, very narrow streets, very old buildings. Curiously, in the last major earthquake, 1985, those buildings, which were built during the colonial period, were the ones that withstood the earthquake much better than the more modern buildings. First of all, because the more modern buildings are much higher, and secondly, because the colonial buildings are built with very wide walls of materials that do not suffer so much during an earthquake. So, but you're right, the urban planning issue is very important. And I think that as we have progressed through the historical experiences, we find that today the damages that take place are much fewer than they used to be. And I think this is true of almost any country. Not only during the recovery period to rebuild what was damaged, but also because you begin to create new rules about construction, about access, about, for example, in Mexico City, every building taller than 3 or 4 stories has to have 2 exit stairways. If you used to only have 1, it was always a problem because everybody would converge on the same stairs to get out. Now you have to have 2. So all of these things are things you learn along the way. And city planners have that responsibility.
Absolutely. All of this is extremely costly, of course. It's a lot of fiscal resources, it's a lot of investment, be it in housing or infrastructure in general, but also in education. All of this is costly, right? And I was wondering how Mexico fared in that regard as well, be it in terms of raising funds to rebuild or in finding in itself and within its economy and society and own capabilities, the ability to finance the expenditure that goes along with building resilience and with rebuilding.
Well, after any major earthquake, of course, the costs are very large. We have a disaster fund, which the government maintains, which is there in case of need, and not only for earthquakes, but also for floods and for storms. We just had in Mexico a very powerful hurricane, of the highest strength hurricane that there is, which hit the resort city of Acapulco on the Pacific coast, with enormous damage. Not so much human losses, but a lot of material losses. And so this fund is created by the federal budget and is there when there are needs for these unforeseen natural disasters. So natural disaster being earthquakes, floods, hurricanes, and so on. But that's never enough. So the government always begins by using these funds that are available, but then complementing that with the private sector for the rebuilding of buildings which are owned by the private sector, and the ability to repair infrastructure that's damaged. Even then, it's never enough. There is always a higher cost to this than you can foresee. But there is at least the initial amounts of budgetary resources for the beginning of the work that needs to be done after a natural disaster.
Ambassador Andres Rozental, thank you so much again for your time and for all your insights on the Mexican case and what we can learn from it. Thank you.
Thank you.